Welcome, everyone, to a presentation on community accountability in climate action. I am Luna Aixin, and I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Keltie Craig, who will guide us through this research project, looking at interesting and inspiring examples of ways that community accountability in climate action is carried out in other places. The project was also supported by Andrea Oakenshield, and we thank her for her research work on this project. So why don't we start us off now, Keltie? To get us going, maybe share with us why this research was undertaken and what were the intended learnings?
Thanks, Luna. Yeah, this is exciting. Well, I think for many of us that have worked on climate policy, we've seen it weakened or we've seen it thrown out as it works its way through the bureaucratic process. And I know how frustrating that can be. And so we thought that trying to understand what features are present in projects and partnerships that strive to meet climate and equity goals can really help us to navigate that process a bit more smoothly. So that was the focus of a research project that we undertook in 2024 on behalf of the City of Vancouver Sustainability Group. A set of research projects helped to guide the project. Number one, what do meaningful climate partnerships look like? Number two, what structures can give community a voice to identify when initiatives are off track in a way that will be heard clearly? Number three, what others have found to be effective to maintain progress through various councils with varying degrees of prioritization of equity and justice? And number four, what are the characteristics of successful climate equity groups? In terms of successful, I just wanted to point out, we wanted to really think about success in the context of kind of community accountability as being that the group brings diverse and typically underrepresented voices to the table and decision-making in a meaningful way. The actions of the group influence policy or policy implementation in a clear way, and the decisions and opinions of the group carry weight with elected officials and the public. So in terms of what we did, we followed a process to scan for potential precedents that might be worth exploring more deeply. And from this, we produced a short list of 12 promising practices. Phone interviews were then held with practitioners connected to each of the precedents to hear more about what the experience was actually like, their challenges, having reflections on the process. And then after writing up the summaries of the precedents, we analyzed each against concepts of power and engagement levels to learn more about how the model worked and in what situation it might be best suited. The precedents we chose were primarily based in Canada and the USA, but we did include a couple of international models, one from Nakuru County in Kenya and one from Wellington, New Zealand. An important principle in this kind of work we really thought was reciprocity. So, how do we do this work in a way that builds more relational rather than extractive ways of gathering information? This can also relate to transparency, to support consent and boundaries. And so to try and support this, we provided a draft version of each precedent summary to the interviewee for them to validate to make sure that it felt accurate and true to how they wanted themselves and the project represented. And then afterwards, we sent a copy of the full research report to each participant for them to use, as well as to share and circulate with their networks. We'll also be sending them a link to this presentation. This felt like a small thing that we could offer, but it felt important to try and start building a relationship between fellow practitioners in the field. So beyond just summarizing what was done, how it was done, and what the impact was, we also wanted to look at bigger systems of power and decision-making and what this potentially meant for each precedent, as well as what it could mean if you were considering a new structure for community partnerships in climate action. Our analysis included considering the perspective of power and decision-making for each precedent. So really, who holds the power and how is it used? We looked at two ways of understanding power. These can exist simultaneously, overlap, reinforce, or contrast each other. We don't have the time to go into a lot of detail of these today, but in the report you can read more. And in summary, one of the ways we looked at power was using the power literacy framework. And this looks at how power is linked to the choices made in how a project is structured. So who is involved? What roles do they have? What are they working towards and how they work? So you can look at 5 ways of gaining power in this framework: privilege, access, goal, role, and rule. And then the other way of looking at power looks more at the reason someone has access to power. So in the case of the first 3 bases of power in this framework, the bases of social power framework, access to power is often connected to how a system is structured, such as a particular governance structure or a specific job position with the duties and responsibilities that comes with that. So those 3 are reward, coercive, and legitimate. And then in the case of the second 3 bases, access to and use of power is a more personal and individual process. It depends more on the characteristics, the knowledge, and the authority of a very particular person or a group of people. So in this case, that is expert, referential, and spiritual power. These were both really interesting to dig into, and I encourage you to read the report as well as seek out other resources to better understand these concepts. The other component we analyzed was the level of engagement that each precedent used. For this, we used a tool that many of you are likely already familiar with, the IAP2 engagement spectrum. So in this framework, the IAP2, or International Association for Public Participation, developed a tool outlining the level of public participation in 5 progressive stages. These relate to how power and decision-making is shared between the institution and those it is seeking to engage with. So we looked at each precedent from this perspective, assessing where it seemed to land on the engagement spectrum. So was it inform, consult, involve, collaborate, or empower?
Thank you, Keltie. We're sharing quite a bit of information with you throughout this presentation, and it does take time to process. And for now, we want to invite you by giving you a few moments to pause and reflect before going into more detail. And to think about this question: what do these initial concepts of power and engagement bring to mind?
So what? What did all of this analysis tell you? Well, based on the various patterns we found in the analysis, we created a set of accountability archetypes. These can be seen as types of governance models that have similar traits related to power, decision-making, and level of engagement. So we came up with civic education and communication, advisory groups, steering groups, co-governance working groups, and community-led committees. From these archetypes, we mapped out the bases of power and IAP2 related to each precedent. I'd like to share with you about the different archetypes, as well as highlight a few inspiring examples from our research. There are far more examples in the report, but today we'll just cover some of these. This matrix just shows at a snapshot how some of the precedents kind of mapped against both the archetypes of power as well as the IAP2 spectrum. And you can see as you move along the IAP2 spectrum from sort of more the inform level over to the empower, it comes with increasing levels or types of power as you sort of move towards more of the co-governance working group and the community-led committees. And we'll see that as we look at some of the examples. So I'm going to start with civic education and communication. This archetype included examples from Chicago, from Ottawa, and from Austin. And when we think about this archetype, the purpose of these types of groups includes educating communities and/or the public about the ways that they can engage in municipal affairs, as well as supporting their participation, including building capacity and leadership. It also includes reporting and communication strategies that emphasize sharing information with communities to create transparency and accountability. Now, although this is more of a one-way communication channel and there's not really power being shared, it does provide resources for communities to open channels through various types of advocacy, such as coming up with campaigns or speaking at council. One of the examples I found really exciting around this type was the first cohort of the Austin Community Climate Ambassadors program. This program coincided with a 2020 update to the Austin Climate Equity Plan. The Ambassadors program was created to reach people who have been systemically left out or misrepresented or ignored during past climate change planning. It was a 6-month paid program where ambassadors learn about climate justice and equity and engage their communities. The first cohort in 2020 included 12 ambassadors. These folks went on to host 35 engagement events, including gatherings, interviews, surveys, and worksheets. The program is really shaped by the interest of participants, but in general, the ambassadors attended monthly meetings to share experiences, to discuss projects, and listen to guest speakers. They participated in workshops and training to learn about climate issues, as well as undertake equity training. And they really built relationships and conducted outreach within their communities and their own networks. At the end of the 6 months, city staff analyzed over 50 interview reports and noted major themes, and then integrated these into the climate equity plan. So a few highlights that I wanted to share in terms of kind of reflecting about the Austin example. In terms of mechanisms for leadership, the ambassadors were not pushing the city messaging, but really going out to their respective communities to gather more insights and share back to the city on key matters. They created more accessible channels of communication between communities and the city, and this was a really great example of community representation and outreach. It was also a partnership with the city that had clear roles. The city considered what work they needed the ambassadors' perspectives and support on, which provided a structure within which ambassadors could then be creative in their engagement. So a few things to consider with this type of approach, the key takeaways that we came up with. The ambassador program takes a lot of resources, including staff. And to date, staff acting as liaisons for this program have been temporary because of challenges in allocating resources. It would really be ideal to have initiatives like this properly accounted for in city budgets and well-resourced to include permanent staff and compensation. Now, that said, allocating resources for community members to engage their own communities in climate action is more cost-effective than city staff doing the same work. This also brings a rich collection of community perspectives back to the city in safer, more relational ways that can redistribute resources to equity-denied communities. Now, the next archetype is one you might be the most familiar with, the advisory group. Advisory group archetypes were the most common form of structure that we looked at in our work. This included precedents from Calgary, Edmonton, Seattle, Toronto, and Vancouver. Now, the role of advisory groups is first and foremost to advise. So they're advising the decision makers and staff. And a defining feature is that they lack direct control and decision-making power, and really the focus is on providing the advice rather than oversight. However, there are many strengths of this model, including their ability to bring ideas, priorities, and perspectives from a wider diversity of the community. Each of these precedents had learning associated with it from these different communities, and I encourage you to read more about them in the report. Next up is the steering group archetype. So steering group archetypes are quite similar to advisory groups. In our research, this included examples from Wellington, New Zealand, as well as Ottawa. And a major difference from the advisory group archetype is that the scope of a steering group includes mechanisms for accountability, such as oversight of projects, the ability to prioritize effort, and keeping institutions accountable for their delivery. Again, I encourage you to read the report to hear more about the Wellington and the Ottawa precedents.
Thanks again, Keltie. So here's time for another pause, as there's a lot of information. So please take a few deep breaths, and then we'll go back to the presentation shortly.
Okay, here we go. So next up is the co-governance working group archetype. Co-governance working groups are characterized by intentional co-leadership structures and the creation of impactful work. Decisions are made in collaboration with government and community representatives. The two precedents that we felt embodied this archetype are the We Will Chicago project and the second cohort of the Austin Community Climate Ambassadors. Just to note, the difference of the second cohort is that they introduced the ability to create ambassador-led community action projects to advance the climate equity plan and had project costs funded by the city. So it sort of moved from that advisor role into more of that co-governance position in terms of actually leading implementation and having some funding associated with it. But I'm going to really focus about the Chicago example as a great example of a co-governance working group. So a bit of background, the development of the 2022 City of Chicago Climate Action Plan was included as part of the citywide planning process called We Will Chicago. So they were sort of dovetailed together. The We Will Chicago plan includes key actions on climate, and a companion We Will Chicago implementation starter guide includes a section on environment, climate, and energy, as well as proposed policies for shared decision-making with community on items like development, zoning, and permitting. One of several collaborations with residents as part of this was the creation of 7 We Will pillar research teams. And in these research teams, more than 500 individuals and organizations submitted applications to be a part of these, and those were reviewed and scored by a group of over 60 volunteers. The final selections reflected the committee's effort to balance applicant scores with geographic representation, with diversity of perspectives, racial and ethnic identity, gender identity, and disability status. These teams met monthly, and they included local volunteers and organizations, artists and organizers, city departments and agencies, and nonprofit community partners. Their role was to collaboratively develop and review the key questions, objectives, and recommendations that shaped the We Will Chicago plan. They also spent time undertaking a historical reckoning related to past planning efforts in Chicago, reflecting on issues such as white flight and how the displacement of Black communities and communities of color contributed to distrust between these communities and city planners. There are a few things to mention in relation to the We Will Chicago precedent. So the co-governance work was a strategic, iterative process of continuously inviting and involving residents and communities in structured ways that are mutually beneficial. So in addition to the pillar research teams, there was also decentralized working groups that developed a cumulative impact assessment. There was a climate action toolkit developed that invites hyper-local resident-led design and implementation. And there was an equity dashboard that provides transparent reporting. In terms of some of the key takeaways, sustained funding and staff time and roles have been really critical to keep things moving in a shared direction. There is also just the recognition that trust building takes time, active listening, and empathy. And so finding ways to hear frustration that really invites people into the work needed to transform that frustration into results has been important. The final archetype that I'm going to share with you is community-led committees. And these precedents were some of the most inspiring examples for us. They included stories from King County, Washington State, from Nakuru County in Kenya, and from Portland, Oregon. Now, a community-led committee is one that holds decision-making power. So while there may be staff liaisons for administrative, technical, or process-related support, the final decision really rests with community representatives. In some cases, community-led committees may also control decisions related to funding or major approvals. I'm going to tell you about the King County Climate Equity Community Task Force, or the CECTF. The development of the King County 2020 Strategic Climate Action Plan included an explicit commitment to equity and social justice as part of climate action. And so early community engagement efforts started in 2017, which was even before the formal planning process began. And this was just in recognition of the time it takes to build trust and relationships with community. And then in 2019, the Climate Equity Community Task Force was convened with 22 community representatives. These members represented a huge diversity of lived experiences, including race and ethnicity, immigration status, income, pollution exposure and health issues, sexuality and gender, language, and experience of pregnancy. The group met bi-monthly over 2 years, and they developed goals and guiding priority areas for climate action based on community values and climate justice concerns. The result of all of this was 31 climate actions across 8 key focus areas, and these were included in a new Sustainable and Resilient Frontlines Community section in the resulting 2020 Strategic Climate Action Plan. So in terms of kind of analyzing the CECTF, one of the things that really struck me was the level of responsibility that the committee had. So they were the main body for identifying community-driven climate actions. But they did this with support. So there was an internal advisory team of staff from a range of King County departments, as well as a full-time climate equity and community partnerships program managers. A few takeaways that we took from this precedent and from conversations with key staff. The King County staff spent a year cultivating relationships with community before making the ask to join the CECTF, and this really highlights the importance of investing in relationships early. And when the original city staff program manager stepped down from the position, it left a big hole, and this acted as a bit of a wake-up call for the county. And so as a result, a new position was created with an elevated title and position and resourcing. This experience also highlighted the potential threat to continuity with the community arising from staff turnover. So that's another really important takeaway. You have to consider that, what happens when a key staff member leaves. The second example of a community-led committee that I want to share is the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund Committee, or the PCEF. So after the Portland Climate Action Plan was updated in 2015, community organizations representing communities of color and low-income residents recognized the need to create a long-term funding source and oversight structure to implement the climate actions. As a result, in 2018, the City of Portland held a ballot measure, which was approved with 65% of the vote, for the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund Initiative. The goal of the fund is to bring an environmental justice approach to create more renewable energy and energy-efficient projects, to focus on decarbonization, and to produce more climate action-related workforce development. The fund revenues come from a 1% tax on retail sales of approximately 500 large companies within Portland. The PCEF committee was established to recommend how that money should be spent. This was a diverse group of residents that formed a 9-member grant committee. The membership criteria included possessing significant experience in the types of projects that are supported by the PCEF. The members reflected the racial, ethnic, and economic diversity of Portland, and that it included a minimum of 2 residents living east of 82nd Avenue. And just as a note for those that aren't familiar with Portland, East Portland is a part of Portland that was annexed in the 80s and 90s, and it's historically been underinvested in. And currently, it's also one of the most diverse parts of the city in terms of race, ethnicity, and income. So they kind of created this threshold to make sure that there was representation from at least 2 members living in this area of East Portland. So by 2023, the fund had allocated $145 million to community programs via community responsive grants. So this was a pretty serious amount of money. Now, while community members are now still involved in scoring these community responsive grant applications, their primary role has expanded. So they're now focusing on developing, recommending, and implementing a 5-year climate investment plan. And over the next 5 years, the PCEF committee will invest over $750 million in community-led clean energy projects and climate solutions through this climate investment plan. So a few things to note about this example. One is just that the PCEF committee has a huge influence on a very substantial level of financial support in the hundreds of millions each year. So that is like a very high degree of kind of sharing power and decision-making with with impact, right? There's also built-in accountability from council. So if council were to modify the recommendations of the committee for the climate investment plan, they need to tell the public why. So there's an accountability built in there. And then conversely, if the committee determines that the investment plan is no longer meeting its purpose, they can then recommend that council amend the climate investment plan. So there is that sort of ongoing level of kind of responsibility and accountability on both parties. In terms of some key takeaways, initially early meetings were facilitated by city staff, but after a time this was changed to use external facilitators to help run the meetings. That created space for staff to ask and answer questions without having to also lead the discussions. And so this was a recommended approach. And second, when the committee was first formed, there was training and capacity building that was offered to help members learn about different needs and experiences within various communities in Portland, as well as learning about various climate issues. However, once the PCF got rolling, the committee members have been kept really busy with work on grant recommendations and creating the climate investment plan, and there just hasn't been much time to provide more background learning. And this has been missed. You know, that sort of ongoing training is something that felt really important to maintain, but currently there's just kind of not the time to support that happening. Okay.
All right, and here we take another pause and to take a few deep breaths. There's a lot of information, Keltie, with good information. And before we move into the next slide, let's again kind of consider these two questions. Which of these archetypes feel familiar to you? And which one feel like a stretch? So think about that. All right, Keltie, back to you.
Okay. So while the community, the climate justice ideal would really be moving further along the IAP2 spectrum and bases of power towards more of that community-led decision-making, I think it's really important that you consider if your organization is ready and resourced to do this work. Because if they're not, you can really risk derailing trust or even creating harm within the communities that you're hoping to empower, if you're not kind of ready to take those steps. So to address this, we came up with a number of key factors to consider and reflect on when designing an engagement and power sharing process. So first of all, budget. In terms of budget, consider providing honorariums and supporting access needs in addition to the costs of facilitation, room rental, food, printing, that sort of thing. Second, staff capacity. Take an honest look at your staff capacity. Is supporting a community group going to be the primary role of a staff member or a side of desk? In a co-creation role, there will be large demands on staff time. If staff act more at arm's length as kind of a liaison or connector, this may not need as much active staff time. Third, organizational readiness, and I kind of commented on this. So has your institution given enough time in sort of learning about and reflecting on equity, decolonization, and justice, and the historic and current role that the institution has played in this? Timing. So think about preparation time. Do you have enough lead time before a specific policy or initiative is created to lay the groundwork needed to authentically collaborate with community? Existing relationships. We've talked about how critical building relationships with community is in this work. And having key staff in place with the skills, the experience, and the respect that community connects with can really help with this. And then also consider a succession plan for if or when key staff transition. And then finally, desired outcomes. So spend some time really thinking about what the desired outcome of community involvement is and what level of engagement might best produce this. In the report, we spell out in more detail where each archetype might be higher or lower needs for each of these categories so that you can kind of determine, you know, where are you at and what is feasible in sort of your existing context. Now, while each precedent we looked at has a unique context, there were some common themes that emerged from the successes and challenges that they each experienced. So first of all, as you start up the process, create a strong foundation with structures and processes in place, but leave space for these to be revised once those partnerships are in place. Be honest and realistic about the resources needed to do this work. Don't rush the recruitment process. Spend time building relationships with community even before formally recruiting, and keep the recruitment window open for long enough to make sure the word can get out. And then finally, create a senior staff level liaison position to help make sure advice and direction set by the group can be communicated directly to senior management. Second of all, think about building supportive structures. So this can include training opportunities for group members. It can include things like a backbone structure of administration, facilitation, and technical support. Ensuring sufficient meeting frequency to maintain momentum without overburdening members, and removing barriers to participation through things like honorariums and other support. Third, think about how to support that community-led implementation after sort of the planning process is underway. So consider formats that enable broader ongoing engagement rather than only informing a specific plan or project. And allocate funding under the control and direction of community. Support members to come up with clear criteria that can meet city and community priorities. And then finally, think about accountability to the broader community. Several precedents made use of public-facing accountability mechanisms, such as dashboards or regular updates. So each of the precedents provides an opportunity for learning and reflection. The participating examples leverage their unique knowledge, experience, circumstances, and power. We hope that you can benefit from their experiential learning and consider what makes sense in your own context at the current moment. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll go back to the workshop now.